Thank you all for joining us today for this conversation on Indo-Pacific security assistance in a new era. So thank you to this wonderfully packed room that we have, and also, of course, to those who are dialing in online from around the region. It's an absolute pleasure to host this conversation today under the banner of our Indo-Pacific Defense and Strategy program here at IISS-Asia in Singapore, looking at Japan's role and its official security assistance program. As many of you will know, OSA was launched in 2023, and it's quite distinct from ODA, Japan's Overseas Development Assistance Program. OSA looks at supporting capacity and capability needs of foreign military forces and looks at supporting activities related to security issues in the region, whereas ODA, of course, is very strictly not related to military and security assistance. So the discussion today really seeks to explore Japan's role of its OSA in this region, and to discuss emerging trends and challenges in this region pertaining to security in the Indo-Pacific. It's also worth noting, of course, that PM Wong recently went to Japan and signed a new strategic partnership with Singapore. And we are, of course, honored to note that the Shangri-La dialogue was mentioned in that, and that there will be an annual ministerial on its sidelines under the defense and security pillar. The Indo-Pacific Defense and Strategy Program at IISS-Asia is really built to examine the questions that we'll explore today, namely to look at and examine new security partnerships, initiatives, and developments across the region, and to really look as well at one of the specific pillars of the program, which is to look at defense partnerships beyond traditional military alliances and how they shape the security environment in the region. And on that note, I'm greatly looking forward to the discussion that we'll have today. I look forward to all your active engagement, as well as many, many questions during the Q&A session. For those of you who are dialing on online, I'm very sorry that you can't join in on that, but hopefully we can follow up in a different format. One housekeeping note, this is an on-the-record event that includes the Q&A as well, and we are recording the session, so it will be on the IISS event websites later. And with that, I will turn to Darshana Baruah to introduce the speakers and to chair the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Viola. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us here and joining this conversation this afternoon. My name is Darshana Baruah, and I'm the Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow for Indo-Pacific Defense and Strategy. Welcome to this panel discussion on Indo-Pacific security assistance in a new era, where we're really trying to look at what does targeted security assistance mean in the region, and that spans wider Indo-Pacific, including Southeast Asia, Pacific, and Indian Ocean. But of course, today we have a panel which will focus a little bit on in the region and closer to Singapore. Let me begin by welcoming our three stellar panelists who I have personally had the opportunity to work with in different capacities and learn from their experience and expertise over the last several years. And joining us today in the speaking order on my extreme right is Mr. Ippeita Nishida, Senior Fellow from the Security Studies Program at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, Tokyo. Thank you so much for joining us here in Singapore in person. Jane Chan, Senior Fellow and Coordinator, Maritime Security Program at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. And finally, my colleague, Dr. Evan Laksmana, Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow for Southeast Asian Security and Defense here at IISS-Asia. Before I invite the speakers to offer their remarks, I just wanted to point out the three things on OSA as a background or as context before we go into the discussion. Villa has already touched on them, but essentially looking at the official security assistance, which is Japan's new initiative, which was established fairly recently in April 2023, and with a specific goal and a aim for the benefit of the armed forces and the related organizations for the purpose of deepening security cooperation. As Villa mentioned, it's different than ODA, which focuses on economic and social development. And I think what's different with OSA is that it provides equipment and supplies as well as assistance for infrastructure development to partner nations with a view to strengthen their security and deterrence capabilities in peace in the world that we are today. I'm absolutely delighted to be moderating this session and hearing from our three speakers on their perspectives, both at the regional level, but also at a very technical aspect of what does the security landscape in the region look like, what does building deterrence look like, and how do initiatives like OSA help, or is it another initiative adding to the crowded space? With that, now let me turn to our first speaker, Ippeita Nishida, for your opening remarks. I'll request each speaker to speak for about 5 to 7 minutes and then a conversation, so we have plenty of time for a conversation and Q&A with the audience. With that, Nishida-san, floor is yours.
Well, great. Thank you very much, Darshana, for this invitation. And it's great to be back in Singapore and meet with the expert colleagues. And especially, I'm very glad to know that, Japan is still relevant to some extent, to be interested. So I think we got the background of ODA, or OSA itself. So I just touched on the three issues. One is why OSA is needed for Japan, the reason why it came out in these days. And the second, the key characteristics. And the third, on the priorities from now on. I've been working on the Japan's foreign engagement policy and tools in particular for quite long. And then I've been looking at this OSA from the beginning and had chances to consult with the Japanese MOFA colleagues and MOD colleagues, as I also chair the external panel of the capacity building side at the MOD. So OSA capacity building are both the Japan's, the military assistance program. We don't call it that a military assistance. We call it security assistance. Because of that, the target we are looking at is not just the military entity itself, but then, we want to have the total the strengths of the country's deterrence and the resilience capability. So let me just touch on the why OSA came into the place. Mainly for the three domestic reasons. One is that over the years after the war, we've been worked so hard to re-engage on the countries in the Pacific, Southeast Asia, and Indian Ocean area, through the use of ODA, the economic and social development, which worked to some extent. But one of the things that we really lacked is the engagement with the militaries. And Japan didn't have much of the idea how to engage with the military entities up until the end of the Cold War, when we started to join international activities through the peace operations or the coalition works, etc. That opened the eyes to the Japanese officials, the importance of the military-to-military engagement and the building of trust, right? In addition to our existing relationship with the United States. So I think that's really the eye-opening moment, after the war, after the end of the Cold War. The second point is the leverage, or the usage of the ODA itself has, to some extent, lowered, in my understanding. As the countries in the region grew their economy, so there's the confidence and the interest changes. The now ODA is seen as sort of a tool for engagement in the country's economy and not having much of the influence compared to the past. We have other competitors, right? China is providing a lot of financial aid in this region. And then, the countries do not need to rely on the ODA for the development. So we needed something extra in addition to ODA. The third is the actual sort of the timing to rethink about our military engagement or security assistance is that the MOD SDF started to to what they call the capacity building support to the defense authorities and the militaries in this region from 2012. The success of this capacity building support was really understood in the policy arena, except that often it lacked equipment support. The countries in the region needed to have equipment as well as the trainings. So there are so many voices in the, among the countries, to have the support on that side. And those three issues came together when the external issue, deterioration of the Indo-Pacific security came in 2000, 2010s, that we also saw sort of the inwardness of the U.S. From the Barack Obama's period, and also the increase in China's the challenges in the region, which made us feel more convinced, as I understand, to engage in the region's security for the the collective interest. Now, having said that, the key characteristics I understand of the OSA is that it's contrary to what the many expect. I think it's not that strategic yet. More for official, when I talk with them, keep on expressing three issues. One is this is not ad hoc nature. This is more continuous engagement that Japan wants to make. Second, we are not looking at arms export as the end objective itself. We want to make the collective resilience of the region. The third is that, Japan actually do have quite similar experiences and issues that can be shared with the countries in the region. For example, maritime domain awareness, maritime security, disaster responses. Those are all needed. And then we also have the capability that interests share. So those are the three issues that the MOFA officials, keep on repeating when I talk with them, right? And my understanding from those is that I think the OSA is not looking at the quick return from what we did or what we do, right? And we are still certainly in mind about the China. However, yet I think it's a more mixed interest in the region, both on the strategic intention and willingness to become sort of long-lasting security partner in this region. That's my understanding. Then, by the way, when you look at the new Sanai Takaichi administration, she keeps on repeating two keywords. One is autonomy, another one is resilience. And for these ends, she says we're going to use the ODA and OSA equally. So I think these two the keywords will characterize her idea of Takaichi's FOIP agenda. Then lastly, on the priorities. So OSA started 3 years ago with very small budget, right? And in 3 years, they have accomplished like 16 projects over 11 countries, mostly in Southeast Asia. The total amount they spent was 15 billion Japanese yen. For the next fiscal year, starting from April, we are expecting to have 18.1 billion Japanese yen, more than total of the 3 years, right? This equals like 116 million USD, by the way. So how are we going to use those money, right? For what purposes and how? Is a big question. I think the geographic focus will remain to be in the Indo-Pacific, although the OSA is designed as as a design, it can be used for any other developing countries. But then I think primary focus will remain in the Indo-Pacific. Southeast Asia first, the Pacific, and then in Indian Ocean probably. Perhaps we may also engage and raise our presence in the East Africa. The functional things. There are 3 pillars under the current OSA policy. One is the rule of law, which can be translated as the maritime domain awareness, surveillance capability, etc. And the second is humanitarian assistance. The third is peacekeeping. When looking at the Japan's use of OSA for the last 3 years, most are allocated for the rule of law pillar, and not much for the humanitarian or peace operations. I think this trend will remain so, but I think Japan should engage a little bit widely on the humanitarian end and the peacekeeping end as well, because as we see, the world is changing so fast, and we will probably see more the difficulties abroad that needs to be addressed. The third, this is perhaps the most of you interested, is are we going to do more high-end military product transfer? Maybe yes, maybe no. We don't know yet. But the reference point is like the coastal radar that Japan provided to the Philippines, which enabled the Philippines to have more eyes in the regions. But then the equipment they sent are more like dual-use purposes, more commercially available, and not military-grade equipment. Are we interested having the provision of the full military spec equipment is a big question. I think this is something that we may be interested to know. The lastly, the mode of engagement. OSA so far has been conducted in the bilateral, with the recipient country. But a few days ago, I think there was the announcement that Japan, Australia, and Fiji trilateral cooperation to enhance the Fijian military forces military barracks using the part of the fund is coming from the OSA. So this kind of the trilateral cooperation with other like-minded, like the United States, Australia, of course, India can be another partner. As the last summit meeting in August, there's a security document agreed between India and Japan, and one of the things they say is a third country cooperation. So we may see more of those trilateral issues, even though the trilateral makes it more complicated to coordinate and sometimes difficult to be accepted by the local communities because of the delicate political relations. And I stop here.
Thank you so much, Nishida-san. That was a fantastic scene setter and sort of looking at Japan's perspective of why OSA now, after having such a long-standing program on ODA. Let me now turn to Jane on what the situation is in the region in terms of capability needs and perhaps specifics into the maritime domain, which is an area that you look at very closely on an initiative like OSA. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Darshana. A quick word of thanks to Dabai Best for the invitation. Very quickly, thank you also, Nishida-san, because it's quite different reading from the fact sheet compared to, listening to Nishida-san, giving context, right? Giving context to the initiative, to the effort, and to essentially showcase, Japan's good understanding of regional priorities and strategy in that sense, right? But I do have two questions for me, and this, Darshana, don't worry, is part of, sharing with the audience my mind space as well, right? In thinking about this topic. The first one is, how will Japan evaluate the success of the program? I know it's early days, but essentially, I'm just very curious, right? Since you mentioned that Japan is not wanting a quick return, but what those return might be in a way that what are the indicators, right, that will be important to Japan? The second one is something that I'm grappling with, not just only on OSA, is how agile do you think that Japan would need to be in assessing a partner's suitability today, right? Suitability for the program, given the evolving geopolitical environment. that is very often outpacing, how quickly Southeast Asia, for example, can respond to Japan, right? In my mind, is a much bigger picture than that, right? Given that we are currently in a very fractured, global order where laws, rules, and regulations are fraying at the seams, where the use of deadly force is increasingly becoming normalized, and where trade is being weaponized, right? So watching all this development unfold near and far, it's very hard for an analyst like myself to walk away without thinking that, hard power is real power today. Right, and how scary it is for small states, right, from a small state's perspective. So, and I'm sure, Japan would have detected by now, how Southeast Asian states are revisiting, some of the assumptions that they're making, revisiting some of the partnerships that they have, both within the region, with, and with extra-regional partners. So the question really is not just about, does it really matter where, the Japanese partner sits in terms of, whether they're leaning closer to US or China, but also, whether political inclination or responses to more recent conflicts and events around the world, right? War in Ukraine, Gaza, Iran, those inclinations, does it give hints to Japan in terms of where your partners are putting their eggs, right? Will that matter to Japan for future programs or even current programs? So of course I have questions for myself as well, Darshana, when she invited me to the panel. I mean, and looking at this topic, the first question I have for myself are what are some of the prevailing maritime security threats and challenges, right, in Southeast Asia? Number two is what do regional states need to manage and mitigate some of these challenges? And number three, of course, is how the OSA fits into, the matrix of what is required by Southeast Asian states effectively to protect and defend its own interests in the maritime realm. When it comes to the maritime priority, I think, looking at this particular crowd, there should be no surprise to this audience, all right? And in no particular order, the first one will always be sovereignty and territorial integrity for Southeast Asian countries, right? Of course, that ranges from, those with maritime and territorial disputes to actually some who are very focused on the interpretation and application of international law, right? And very often, and increasingly, these weighs on, the rights and obligations of the coastal state or archipelagic states versus the rights and duties of the user states, right? Of course, then, number two would be a whole gamut of what we call non-traditional security challenges, IUU fishing, trafficking, terrorism, et cetera, et cetera. And if we aggregate all these events, let's just take the last 5 years, for example, right? Within the region and outside the region, we have to now add a very worrisome trend of gray zone activities as well, and of course, threats towards critical undersea infrastructure. So in my mind at least, it should not be a surprise to see countries in this region investing in, maritime law enforcement capabilities, and of course, where naval modernization programs are being ramped up, right? So what else does regional state need, right? For the most part, in my mind, again, and many of my friends would have heard me say this, a better and shared maritime picture, or MDA, as Nishida-san highlighted, is always going to be on the top of the list. And we already saw, right, the sensors, radar, and other surveillance systems were immediately put into use. To what extent, to how much ROI in that sense, is up to people like Evan to measure, right? But we also know that military capability is all but one option for regional states, right? Again, to me, diplomatic prowess is the most important, right? Receiving states will very likely be very cautious about, the what and how much and from whom they are receiving these assets. And of course, some of these may create constraints or problems at the diplomatic front and maybe take away some form of autonomy or neutrality, right? So how does OSA fits into this whole matrix? We have seen already individual countries increasing their military capability, I'll leave the capacity problem to Evan again. So MDA, right, maritime infrastructure, naval and coastal support, they are all there. But, they are not transforming the military balance, so to speak, right? But in a way, it was never meant to do that, right? At least, that's how I read it to be. So that was never the objective. So a focus, again, on MDA and the correlating info-sharing systems to fuse and infuse data and network is a good, first start. And it should be a priority consistently. What more you can do, of course, is always good. So one last point is that right now, I think Japan sits in a sweet spot, right, in and among Southeast Asian states, and that the OSA has created a space for regional country in a limited way on a few things where they don't have to decide between US and China, right? But again, very curious how challenging it is going to be for Japan, actually, to keep that balance going. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you, Jane. I would have been disappointed if you didn't start your presentation with questions. So thank you for staying true to your research. Let me now turn to my colleague, Dr. Laksmana. Floor is yours.
Thanks, Darshana, and thanks everyone for coming on this pretty humid kind of afternoon. So I'll just be very quick, just 3 key caveats and then 3 key arguments on this particular topic. The first caveat is that I think when we think of security assistance, I think it does get us into very conceptually stretched areas, because security can mean intelligence, law enforcement, military, and so forth. So I just want to focus on the military part, as the previous speaker has spoken about. Second is obviously, I'll look at it from a Southeast Asian perspective, and it shouldn't be a surprise that there is no such thing as a singular Southeast Asian view on these things. And this is not just a throwaway line, but I do think it matters for when we talk about some of the policy considerations of what kind of military assistance that might work for Southeast Asian states. And the third sort of caveat is I look at military assistance in this case as a subset. It's a subset of defense diplomacy more broadly. And I'll explain in due course why that is the case. So the first argument is that when I think about military assistance in general, I see that as a multiplex market, which is every country has a list of defense goods that they want, whether it's education, training, exercises, hardware, software. So we can't say that it's only about security needs and that's it. There's a list of different types of security goods in which different partners have different strengths. Very few countries can provide all aspects of those defense goods. Education, training, exercise, hardware, not every country can provide that. So that's why the region, I think, views security partners also in that way. When people say partnership diversity, they don't actually mean equal, because they're not equal in terms of defense provision. Some partners are better at some aspects than others. So to say that Southeast Asian states are reducing military dependencies on some countries by partner diversification is understandable, but also not really accurate, because it's not really easy to replace some providers who can provide the different range of military goods as we talked about. So in that kind of multiplex market where different partners can provide different things, I do think understanding the military needs that are specific and, dare I say, almost bespoke is a lot more difficult for Southeast Asian countries. Some countries would be much more interested in military capabilities because they have a border problem. Other countries, they have a bigger problem in terms of maritime. Now, some of these things, I think, brings us into questions about, as Jane says, there's a wide range of security needs just on the maritime side, but we often forget that in Southeast Asia, even in maritime Southeast Asia, it's still an army-dominated establishment. So what the armies think about security needs also matters. And this is where new ideas around littoral security becomes important. Issues around ground force modernization also becomes important beyond just some of the maritime security needs. So this brings me to my third set of concerns, which is sort of the policy considerations. If we have a multiplex sense of market in terms of different types of military goods provision, when you have different types of military needs, which isn't always determined by a singular set of issues like maritime security, especially when you look at the role of armies in Southeast Asia, then the third question becomes, what is the metric that you use for military assistance being successful? Now, officially, people say it's deterrence, as noted in the OSA kind of policy, to help to recipients to improve their deterrence. But how do we know you successfully achieve deterrence? The outcomes that you get versus the process that you invest are two different things. So for me, rather than focusing on outcomes that you can't really measure, hence the murkiness of the metric of successful military assistance, I would venture that figuring out military effectiveness and defense readiness in general, the processes of strategic assessment, defense planning, the incorporation of C4ISR, command and control that's much more enhanced, doctrinal revisions, these are more or less not as expensive as major combat platforms, but I would argue equally, if not more important, for the military needs of Southeast Asian states. So yes, hardware is obviously top of the list. Most countries in Southeast Asia, most of their major weapons platform is between 25 to 40 years old. So there's definitely a need for a modernization and replacement of aging equipment, certainly the case. And there are certainly genuine security needs, borders, maritime, domestic, certainly all there. But the processes around a military effectiveness and defense readiness, the software and the brainware, I think is also something that needs to be put into serious thought. My last point on this metric is obviously, as it relates to Japan, is the coordination and competition. Who else is actually providing military assistance to Southeast Asian states? Now, some countries in the region have been providing, let's say, education and training program for the last 50 years. So therefore, you have thousands of alumni of those countries' military programs. Other countries may have only started in the last 10 years, but they've slowly gaining ground and changing the perception of that country across Southeast Asia. Now, ideally, Japan would coordinate obviously with countries like, South Korea, Australia, Singapore, and other countries. But if there is no common metric, if there is no long-term roadmap of what military assistance in general looks like, and there's no clear assessment of the different military needs, not just on specific issues like maritime security or HADR or peacekeeping, then I think for Southeast Asian states, Japan's provision of security assistance can still be meaningful and substantial, but I worry that it might become secondary to the other partners who have been providing a wide range of security assistance for a longer time. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Evan. All three of you have raised some really important points, some overlaps, some different perspectives, and I think this was essentially the point of the discussion, to have experts who've been watching some of these debates and topics, so you're able to go straight into a deeper conversation. Before I open it up to sort of the floor for Q&A, I'll come back to the panel to if any one of you wanted to respond to each other's points or comments or remarks, because they are very different. I think somewhere you've all challenged each other as well. So I think it'll be interesting to hear from you. And I have sort of some questions of my own, but I'll hold those. I did want to point to one thing in terms of, I look at Indo-Pacific more broadly in both Indian Ocean and Pacific. And I think the conversation is different whether you go to Pacific, whether you go to Southeast Asia, whether you go to Indian Ocean. And Japan, of course, looks at Indo-Pacific from the coast of Africa to the US, so it includes Djibouti as well in the coast of Africa. And then the other is, of course, the islands, whether it's in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. So I think when we talk about security, when we talk about deterrence, it means different things in different geographies and different regions, and OSA would adjust accordingly. for someone who watches the developments in the wider Indo-Pacific, to me, OSA marks one very interesting thing, which is something I've been debating and exploring in my own research, is that the definition of security itself, and I think Jane touched on this. I think we tend to conflate sometimes security with geopolitics as well, and there is a tendency to have a strong distinction between traditional security and non-traditional security issues, so that you're not walking into geopolitics, because you're so conscious about the politics around it. But I've started to say that not wanting to debate geopolitics doesn't mean that you're sidestepping geopolitics. You're just walking into it unprepared. So I think somewhere that conversation perhaps is useful. But in the last decade, and perhaps more so in the immediate past, we are witnessing a continued blurring of lines between traditional and non-traditional security threats. Let's say, for example, maritime domain awareness. Maritime domain awareness applies both for anti-submarine warfare and illegal fishing, right? So the domain remains the same, but the tools, the approach, the partners, they change. So I do think Japan, that Japan, who has built such a legacy through its development assistance, launching an initiative focused on security and military and armed forces, captures that shift in the conversation we're having in regional security and the challenges ahead. Somewhere that conversation on security has shifted, and I think the taboo around hard power or not wanting to talk about security as a need of the hour is somewhere becoming important to discuss. I'll turn to the panel if you want to respond to each other. If briefly on any of the points, feel free to raise a specific point or add anything. Maybe I'll start this side. Evan, with you.
Sure. I guess to pick up on what you said earlier about non-traditional security and the blurring. First of all, I'm sorry to be slightly academic here, but I actually don't like the idea of non-traditional security. Because for Southeast Asia, the traditional security is actually illegal fishing. It's actually border conflicts. So to say that somehow non-traditional security is now a thing, it's kind of weird. The non-traditional security for Southeast Asia is conventional major war. That's the non-traditional part. Semantics aside around what's traditional and non-traditional, I do think the challenge with security in general, or in this case with security assistance, is the temptation to expand, when I think actually the opposite, it should be narrow, because otherwise you dilute the effects of what you can do with not a lot of resources to begin with, both in terms of the recipient and the sender. If you dilute the concept of security assistance to all and everything, it could be defense industrial capacity building, it could be maritime law enforcement, it could be intelligence reform, then you actually dilute the effects of security assistance. So for me, it's actually to resist the temptation to expand the concept of security, to expand the concept of assistance, and actually narrow it even further to military assistance, and focus on what the militaries actually need to be effective and ready, whatever those challenges could be. And it's not up to, I think, outsiders to define what those specific uses of the effectiveness and those readiness could be. Because it's possible that if you design a program that, say, for the next 10 years, we just want to focus on maritime security, and then the army establishment of that country decides, actually, for the next few years, we want to do border. Does that mean it still fits with the maritime security program? It's a bit of a bureaucratic challenge, right? And so for me, yes, I think it's correct to say that there is an expansion, an overstretch, dare I say, on the idea of security assistance. But it's precisely because of that I would actually revert back and actually make it as narrow and as sharp as possible.
But Evan, you know that once you do that, it's not going to work. Nobody's going to move on it, especially in Southeast Asia, isn't it? But, I'm fully with Evan on this. And then we have been debating, about this in terms of, do we keep it fuzzy and, non-distinct, so that the substance of some of this initiative is not the underlying objective. And I'll take MDA, for example. So Darshana has been very keen on, what does it actually mean, right? But, I've been saying for years that, these days when you mention MDA and you put capital letters on M, D, and A, not many in Southeast Asia are interested because there's a label that this is a US-led initiative, no matter how you put it, right? And this is really more so post-IPMDA. But if you get rid of the capital letters and you're talking about maritime situational awareness, maritime domain awareness, info sharing, et cetera, it becomes less sensitive, right? So do we really want to label some of these things and make it so obvious and so clear? Because most recently I've heard a totally different definition of MDA, and it has nothing to do with, sending sensors and stuff in the ocean. So then again, the wariness in me, right? The Southeast Asian in me is like, ooh, I have to be very careful about this. But I want to pick a point that, Evan mentioned about coordination between donors. I thought the sense in Southeast Asia has always been more is more. Right. So once there is coordination and stuff like that, again, if you overlap these two, the distinction between substance and underlying objective, then it becomes very, very clear what exactly we are doing. In my mind, more effective, of course, is good, but I'm not sure, how effective it will be for the donating country in that engagement with Southeast Asian countries.
Okay, thank you very much for those great points. Let me just touch on the points of this. Evan talked about, perhaps you should better narrow down your focus. It's a really important issue and relates to all other points relating to OSA. The balance between the delicate balance between China and the US, and also the Japan's sort of military past, how to deal with the this past memory, right? For example, if I have like an 18 billion Japanese yen to be able to provide military equipment, I would want to say the military-grade air surveillance radar system in Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia. Connect them together in the same system, and we have the information sharing. Then we know everything. Is it going to be accepted? No. Is it going to have a good reputation with Japan? No. And is it going to be good for our political end? No, not at all. This brownness of the traditional, non-traditional, or geostrategic, or the regional needs, whatever, is really important, I think, for Japan to maintain. Because of the fact that we don't want to be seen as such strategic, the actor with a strategic interest to implicate in the region's security. It's not our interest to direct other countries to do something for us. And it's not our interest to have some others to use or to make narrative of the remilitarization, right? So I think this touches on some of the points that you already touched on. Then another issue is that the equation part. I mean the success, how to measure. One of the I think good point and also the frustration for me on this OSA is that they actually replicated the system of ODA. For Japan to make ODA, they take long time consultation with a partner country, asking what you need, why you need, how does it going to be useful. Normally it takes more than a year, right? And they do all the negotiation, do a bureaucratic process, and end up having engagement note between the formal engagement note between the countries. This process actually, gives us small room to respond to that so much change in the region, to be late to and make us less flexible and less adaptable to the changes. And also it gives us the transparency, especially for the Japanese citizens. We can monitor what's going on with the government, and how they're going to be using the money, for the taxpayers. So this actually lessens the strategic issue, and also makes the responsibility of the operational, the performance issue to the recipient side, because it's a recipient who say we want to do this, we want this, that. But we need to also think, about how to measure from our policy interest. That's for sure. That is to be probably, the measured in terms of the level of the competency of the country with the equipment or the tool we provide, or the level of the interoperability the Japanese self-defense force can have with the recipient military, or the level of our acceptance in the country or in the region to do the activities together. So I think all those points that you have raised are all connected, but I need to come back to this. The ambiguity is something Japan, I think, really find is necessary, not just in terms of describing what kind of challenges we need to respond to, but because of our interest.
Thank you. I think we can go back and forth with the different challenges. And at some point, Jenny, you and I need to talk about IPMD and what really happened on that. But let me open the floor for questions and comments. Please raise your hand. There should be a mic coming to you, and introduce yourself briefly. The gentleman, yes. Thank you.
All right. My name is Yong-Wook Ryu from Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. I really enjoyed the presentations and panel discussion. Just want to state the fact that Japan can only provide non-lethal military equipment. So if you constrain Japan's OSA to the military domain, then that's right. It will even further constrain the kind of things that the Japanese government can do. The couple of points that I want to raise, it's not really questions, but it's a food for thought for perhaps further discussion. I think Japan's return to the international military or security scene is not only a welcome sign, but it's a must, right, under the current international environment. And OSA can be one useful avenue for Japan to return to the international security scene, right, in a smooth way. But here, I think we also should be mindful of potential misperception or danger. My understanding, based on my own interactions with Japanese MOFA and defense officials, is that China looms very large in its formulation of OSA programs in this part of the world. And in some sense, it's unavoidable given the current strategic environment. But I think the right kind of mindset for the Japanese government to take is not so much about China, but it's actually providing public goods in the region and also exercising leadership role, right, which is what's needed in this part of the world. Now, of course, sometimes if you contribute to the public provision of regional security, that may necessarily take on anti-China stance, but it's but the starting point is very different, right? So rather than doing activities and programs that are countering, right, expanding Chinese military influence in the South China Sea, you should assume that the starting point should be how can we contribute to the public goods of regional security, right? What are the things that the Japanese government can do in that domain? I think that should be the right mindset to take in. The second point that I want to make is the OSA is not necessarily constrained to military, right, or security, and maybe this is right. It's a negative thing because as Nishida-san mentioned, there's a blurry line between ODA and OSA.
So I'm so sorry. Would you mind keeping a little bit more crisp so that there are quite a few hands in the room?
Okay. So the second thing is one area where the OSA can be useful in the region is providing assistance to the civil society groups. If you think that there's an interaction between domestic stability and international security, one area where the region really needs now is assistance to civil society groups. And maybe that's something for the Japanese government to consider. Thanks. Sorry.
Thank you. And no, I will commit to continue the conversation after. We'll have a chance as well. I saw a few other hands. I'll come this side with William and then Celine. Sorry. Yes. Sorry.
Hi, Ian Chong, National University of Singapore. So my questions are really for Nishida-san, because I think what we've heard so far is that there are multiple interests across Southeast Asia. But that gets us to be academic for a moment, and a principal agent problem, right? You have to, if you want to engage, you have to account for multiple interests, both domestic and also across the region. What's the thinking in terms of how to coordinate to make sure that Japan is actually able to move forward on its goals, rather than to get distracted by all these things going in different directions? Thanks.
I will take one more question, Celine.
Thank you. Céline Pajon from the French Institute of International Relations in Paris. So my question is for Ippeita. You said that OSA is mostly for Indo-Pacific region, but I noticed that in the past, Mongolia was one of the recipients. And also, you know that Japanese government is advocated for the interconnectedness of theater. This is very important. And so in this regard, how do you see the OSA being applied potentially to Ukraine post-conflict in a way or another? Thank you.
All three questions were to you, but Jane and Evan, if you wanted to add to any of this, please.
Right. Thank you very much for the great questions. Talking about the lethal weapons export, these are big discussion going on in Japan, and the Takaichi government is I think very interested to relax our export of the military weapons. Right. Currently, is like the condition that all the military equipment that we can provide outside needs to be under the 5 categories: rescue, transportation, surveillance, and the monitoring and the mine sweeping. That actually restrict the items. So you can also say that it's reducing our impact in the region. At the same time, it protect us, right? But when removing this lethal this barrier, for us to be able to transfer the lethal weapon, whether and if it's going to implicate on the OSA policy, the first, I think it's not going to be, because I think largely they've been discussing in terms of the actual military equipment transfer between the governments through the MOD, the ATRA to other countries, or the sales, right? And OSA with a limited budget, and it also has the constraints. I mean, it has the sentence that it's not going to contribute to active the conflict. So actually, it safeguards the use of the OSA, not to be used for the military end. The second thing, you also mentioned that blurring line between OSA and ODA. I didn't say that. I said blurring line between this the non-traditional security and the traditional security, and not about ODA and OSA, right? But having said that, the civil society group need to be assisted. I agree. But then OSA is mainly targeting the defense entity, right, the country. And if this is something that needs to be addressed to the civil society group, it needs to be done by our ODA side. The thirdly, on the multiple interest, it's very difficult to coordinate, to be honest with you. Even within the Japanese government is very famous for its stovepipe system. And while OSA is located in MOFA, and the military system, capacity building, for example, is in the MOD. And there is no standing sort of secretariat to coordinate how our regional engagement needs to be. Moreover, relating to what Darshana said, each of the different theaters has different needs and the stakeholders and the ways that we can engage. But up to now, as far as I understand, Japan hasn't really set out or published the sub-regional engagement strategy in this big Indo-Pacific region. So what I'm hoping, and what I think there's discussion starting in the government, is that we probably need to have more focused the regional plans, in the new FOIP or in the new NSS. I don't know if those things will come up, but they're important. Lastly, on the Celine's point on the Ukraine, it's my interest to support Ukraine. I think OSA can be used, but at the moment, I think the government is not really intending to use it. For the many of the fact that the active the war is going on, and there's quite delicate relationship for Japan with Russia as well, and also with the US. So I think the best way for us to support the European conflict is, to support, to cooperate with France or EU or NATO's effort to support the Ukraine forces on, on the equipment, also the capacity building trainings. I just went to the EU-MAM UA site in Poland and Germany half a year ago, and there's much of the possibilities that Japan can contribute to support the European efforts. Thank you.
Did you want to add anything? No, Jane? Any other questions in the room? I'll come to side. Yeah, Ju.
Anne-Marie Schleich, I'm with IISS as well. I have a question for Nishida-san. You mentioned the first trilateral agreement between Japan, Australia, and Fiji under the OSA. I seem to have noticed that ODA as well as OSA has increased with the Pacific Island countries. Would you judge that as a response of Japan in view of China's security agreements with the Solomon Islands as well as the Cook Islands? Thank you.
Did you have a question as well? Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Faisal from IISS. I also have a question for Nishida-san. So far with regard to OSA, we've heard about how it's useful for capabilities such as maritime or radar systems. But I'm curious, how useful is OSA in terms of enhancing the cyber defense posture of the receiving countries, especially in today's context when the use of cyber capabilities is often used to complement the strategic goals of kinetic attacks? Thank you.
And one more, Ippeita.
Thanks. This is for, I guess, anyone who wants to answer it. I'm Ippeita with the IISS. Would the inclusion of hybrid issues such as the disruption of undersea cables under the OSA be seen positively by ASEAN countries? Would there be concerns on its inclusion given China's dominance in the undersea cable supply chain?
Mr. do you want to take the questions directed to you? And there was more general to the panel.
Sure. Thank you. I think the Pacific Islands is really important, increasing as you articulated. I think we're quite watchful how China is getting in the game in the Pacific. I think the Australia and Japan has a common interest and concern on the Chinese engagements in the region. Moreover, I think beyond the first island chain and second island chain, how we're going to have the comprehensive engagement is something we need to concern more, as we see more Chinese fleets coming out from the first island chain and navigating in the Pacific. So that is something that I find quite interesting development. And in addition to the ODA, OSA engagements in the Pacific, ODA has been done in the past for quite a long time. But for example, the Ministry of Defense has started doing what they call Japan Pacific Island Defense Ministers Dialogue a few years ago. They just concluded the third one this February. And they declared that they're going to have more enhanced engagements in the region. Secondly, on the does it mean for the SDF, in the receiving the side. What I've been talking in Japan is like, while more attention is being given to the equipment provision, I think we should be focusing more on the infrastructure development of the receiving militaries and defense authorities, or the the dual-use facilities like ports, the airports, so that those can be used in when it comes to the disaster relief, for example, or for the Japanese self-defense forces to have more presence in the region. Thank you.
Jane?
Thank you very much for raising the issue of critical undersea infrastructure and how increasingly there are more attention right now in Southeast Asia looking at this particular issue. But there's plenty of room for us to build both the capability and the capacity to manage this particular threat. And first and foremost, you need to first know where the threat is coming from or where it lies, right? So that the MDA proposal, or the MDA priority that Nishida-san is mentioning is very, very important. And the latest discussion, of course, is UMDA, and that, of course, is going to be a lot more sensitive. But my view is that we have heard China claiming to be a victim of, damage to their cables and pipelines and undersea infrastructure as well. So if that is the case, why should it be sensitive, right? Shouldn't it be an avenue where, more discussion in the region about CUI should come to fall, more discussion about the rules, laws, and then principles about, how individual countries need to protect them, about, the legal mechanism to identify, to attribute, right, should come to fall. So, in my mind, if Japan is willing to take the initiative to work with Southeast Asian partners on yet another maritime security issue, CUI should be one of the priorities.
I think as Singapore takes chair next year for ASEAN, maybe this is something that'll be debated in terms of the conversation on CUI and the framework and what it should be, what should the discussion within ASEAN members themselves, right?
Yes. So, just one more line in that. I think ASEAN has already taken a very obvious step last year. At the end of last year, ADMM has put up a concept paper on CUI. And this is not the first, right? Southeast Asia has been looking at this for almost a decade now with few naturally statements and papers. I know what everyone is thinking about. But, given that the concept paper is, also co-sponsored by Singapore, I think you are right. That should be, something that that should come to the fore. In how it's going to manifest itself is something that ought to be discussed within Southeast Asia and also with dialogue partners.
Evan?
Yeah, I think just to, I guess 2 quick points. One on some of the conversation around, if there is a concern whether or not if Japan's focus on OSA is creating risks of being perceived as militarization and all of those things. What I think I wasn't particularly clear on, and maybe I should have been, is that precisely because the needs of militaries, at least from the perspective of Southeast Asia, is quite diverse. For me, the biggest area that very few actually pays attention to, despite being, I think, is the most important part, is actually organizational needs, which is education and training and the enhancement of strategic assessment and defense planning. So if, of course, I understand, and from the conversation as well, that this could be an MOD thing, like capacity building, so it's not a MOFA thing. But I completely agree with Nishida-san that, if there was a way to bridge MOD and MOFA for security assistance and make it much broader, the way that the US did it 30, 40 years ago with Defense Security Cooperation Agency, yes, I think that would be the most ideal, because I do think Japan has an interesting but underappreciated military history as a strategic capital in terms of education and training across Southeast Asia that hasn't been discussed. In Indonesia, for example, Indonesia was notorious to never send its academy cadets to foreign overseas education training program, except for Japan. And so there are a lot of useful education and training program activities that, for me, is more bang for buck, given that the original bang for buck in terms of OSA is small to begin with. If the subset of hardware is already very small, because it's not going to be used for, like, frigates and submarines, if it's going to be for small patrol boats, that's important for small tactical purposes. But if the goal is long-term, I think education and training and organizational needs like doctrinal revisions, these are all things that is still very much in need and still in play. And this goes to, I guess, the question around hybrids and CUI and ASEAN, as Jane says. I think what's good about ASEAN is precisely its norms exercise functions and not crisis response. But in practicality, when it comes to certain new issues, new quote unquote, like CUI and all of those things, the actions or the activities or the practicalities actually have happened first before norms are built. So in that kind of circumstances, channeling assistance to ASEAN would be productive if it's directed not for another round of norms exercise, but whether or not existing mechanisms can actually be enhanced for specific practical purposes, which I don't think the answer lies at ADMM, although they certainly have more exercises than any other kind of mechanism. But the issues, I think you will find that if you go across ASEAN Regional Forum, ADMM, ADMM Plus, not to mention the 19 different ASEAN military meetings and mechanisms, these issues have come up, CUI or otherwise. So the challenge isn't, has it come up? The challenge is, well, then what's next?
I'll take one last question if anyone has a brief one. Vic, I'll go with you. Sorry, Morgan.
Hi, Big Chan, a research fellow with IISS. So I heard a story about, a country in South Asia which was very reluctant to engage in OSA, arguing that, security assistance, for example, patrol boats under ODA was working fine. So why OSA? So I wonder how would Japan kind of convince that country or other partners to engage in OSAs in the purpose of Japan? Thanks.
Yeah, I'm going to squeeze in one last question, Morgan.
Thanks, Morgan Michaels from the IISS. I had just two very quick questions. The first is, with the budget, do we expect a decline in the budget of ODA to fund OSA? And secondly, what about some of the risks? For example, if OSA was provided to Thailand and Cambodia, and then these technologies were used by both sides in a border conflict. Thanks.
All right, final comments to the panel. You have 2 minutes, so.
Okay, thank you very much for those great questions. Well, I mean, it's really interest of the receiving country, right? If the country say, oh, we are fine with the ODA, that's it. But then, well, we can just tell them the offer, what we can do. It's not our, waiting, we can force them, for them to receive it, right? So I think unless the country, doesn't find like an interest, it just go like that. But then second point on the decline of budget, actually this year we found increase of ODA budget as well, in addition to large increase of OSA. And it seems to be, to me, that Japanese government, especially under the Takaichis, finding those two tools as really important tools of engagements. And we know that we're going to have the national security strategy to be revised at the end of the year. The last one in 2022 actually directed the use of the ODA for the purpose of national security. This time, they may be more clear how they want to use ODA. I don't know. Under the ODA, as our colleague said, we've been supporting the Coast Guard or the maritime security projects in the Southeast Asia already, right? So we will see how it goes. Risks are always there, but as I told you, the transparency is really Japanese OSA as they copy the ODA, and then they have conduct all those the memorandum understanding with the receiving side. So at least from that kind of formality, that kind of risk is removed. But what actually happens is another question.
Jane.
Well, I ended my remark earlier on about Japan being in a sweet spot. And I think I will want to re-emphasize this again, because that sweet spot is built on a very long, investment of trust and confidence, measures and engagement that Japan has done with Southeast Asian countries. And, I would be very, very cautious, right? In the early success that you have seen with this, to not, squander that trust and confidence, especially in the current, geopolitical dynamic that we are seeing. Japan will, of course, be assessing all Southeast Asian countries and recipient countries in terms of, where their alliance and preferences are moving. But, the other way around is also true. So, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Evan, last word.
Just very quick, I guess a little bit contra to Jane. I think I agree that Japan certainly is at the sweet spot. Certainly, Japan has a huge amount of strategic capital in Southeast Asia built over decades, economic, political, diplomatic, etc. But for me, it's the slightly opposite conclusion, which is maybe Japan should be a little bit bold on the security assistance side of things because it has a huge strategic capital.
Excellent. Thank you so much to all three of you for adding such depth to this conversation, challenging each other, and then also finding some common grounds and some policy recommendations, I would say. Before I welcome you to join the panelists, just a quick housekeeping note. We will have a cocktail and networking reception after this. It'll be right outside right outside these doors, so please do join us for that. But for now, please join me in thanking the panelists and such a stimulating discussion. Thank you all for joining us this evening.